The rope groaned under the weight as Henry Caldwell's body swung from the old oak, the humid Memphis dusk wrapping him in silence. His fine Sunday clothes, once pressed and proper, now hung in ruin. By dawn, the other slaves would stumble upon the scene, but Isaiah Turner would already be gone, his trail erased by the night's rain. What could drive a man known for quiet obedience to such an act? The answer was rooted in secrets Henry carried to his grave, hidden truths that had poisoned the plantation for years, concealed beneath the pious surface of Sunday prayers. The day itself had begun, as countless others on the Caldwell estate, the bells clang, cutting through the cotton fields at sunrise. Isaiah rose from his straw pallet, his tall frame unfolding with practiced weariness. At 35, he was respected among the slaves, though he rarely spoke more than was necessary. His dark eyes revealed an intelligence carefully masked beneath submission, a survival tactic honed over decades. The Caldwell plantation spanned 800 fertile acres, its grand house a glaring white monument to wealth built on bondage. Henry Caldwell had inherited the land and its 47 slaves just 3 years earlier, earning a reputation as one of the more reasonable masters, priding himself on what he called a Christian household. He required attendance at Sunday services and claimed to treat his slaves with biblical kindness, though his words never matched reality. Isaiah had been born here sold alongside his mother when the elder Caldwell needed gambling money. His mother died of fever when he was 12, but not before secretly teaching him to read from torn Bible pages smuggled out of the big house. That knowledge, hidden like a concealed blade, was his most dangerous possession, one that could cost him his life if discovered. October's air carried the first bite of winter as Isaiah pulled on his best shirt reserved for church. Around him, the others prepared for the mandatory service, the small wooden chapel looming near the master's home. Isaiah had sat through hundreds of these sermons, where scripture was twisted into chains, preached as if slavery itself were heaven's design. The slaves filed in a procession toward the church, their faces forming a dark river flowing against the bright sky. Social lines existed even among them, house servants walking with quiet pride, field hands moving with beaten resignation, and children still unbroken by years of labor. Henry Caldwell rode alongside on his chestnut horse, greeting neighbors who paraded their own human property in tow. At 28, the young master was considered progressive by local standards, a man who claimed to wrestle with the morality of slavery, even as he prospered from it. His recent marriage to Margaret Whitmore, daughter of a wealthy banker, had elevated his standing further. Caldwell often spoke of new humane ways to manage his plantation, but his philosophies never reached the fields. As the service began, the familiar hymns rose into the air, the words ringing hollow for Isaiah, who sat in silence at the back, waiting, watching, carrying the weight of truths that would soon reshape the plantation forever. The voices of the slaves rose together in song, filling the small wooden church, while Henry Caldwell sat up front, turning his head now and then to make sure every voice joined in. Reverend Clayton, a traveling preacher who made his rounds across several plantations, stepped to the pulpit and began his sermon with a familiar passage from Ephesians, reminding servants to obey their masters. Isaiah barely listened. He had heard the same sermon dozens of times, always twisting scripture into chains. Clayton's nasal voice spoke of submission of God's divine order that placed white men in power and black men beneath them. But Isaiah's thoughts drifted to the book hidden under the floorboards of his cabin. 3 months earlier, he had stumbled upon it after it fell from a merchant's wagon, a collection of abolitionist speeches that offered a very different vision of Christianity. One that spoke of freedom and justice, rather than obedience and suffering. Each Sunday since the gap between the Christ he read about and the one preached in this church had grown more unbearable. Clayton went on claiming slavery was a burden white Christians carried for the good of those too simple to fend for themselves, that the plantation system gave structure to lives otherwise wasted. Isaiah looked around and read the faces of his people, some bowed in resignation, others masking their anger, a few clutching their faith tightly as the only comfort they had left. For Isaiah, the words burned with hypocrisy. At the front, Margaret Caldwell sat beside her husband, a young woman of 22, dressed in pale blue, every stitch of her gown and tilt of her hat, marking her separation from the congregation behind her. Raised in Memphis high society, she had been taught all the refinements expected of a wealthy white woman, music manners, and how to oversee the slaves in her household. Her marriage to Henry was as much a transaction as a romance, uniting his land with her father's banking fortune. Yet Isaiah noticed Henry's eyes rarely lingered on his wife during these services. Instead, they sought out Clarissa, an 18-year-old slave girl who worked in the big house kitchen. Clarissa's light skin and delicate features betrayed a history of forced mixing, though she had been born into bondage like the rest. Henry's gaze carried the unmistakable hunger Isaiah had seen before in other masters, the look that foreshadowed the same pattern of abuse slavery made possible, and law itself protected. No one dared to speak of it aloud, but everyone knew. When the service ended with another hymn, the congregation filed out the weight of Sunday, pressing down once more. The masters would return to fine meals and social visits, the slaves to their quarters, their one afternoon of limited rest before another week of labor. For Isaiah, the walk back was a time to turn over the contradictions in his mind, to wrestle with the difference between the freedom he read about in secret and the chains he wore in plain sight, knowing the tension could not last forever. Something in the air that day felt charged, though Isaiah couldn't put a name to it. The October chill hinted at the coming winter, but the unease he carried went deeper than the weather. Lately, moments like this had been coming more often, flashes of awareness that cracked through the walls he had built to contain his anger. As the sun dipped low over the Mississippi, Isaiah sat outside his cabin with the forbidden book balanced in his lap. The fading light caught on the words of Frederick Douglass, who spoke of literacy as the key that unlocked the mind, the first step toward freedom, even when chains still bound the body. The words burned inside Isaiah, fanning a flame he had tried for years to smother. Hearing footsteps, he hid the book under his jacket, his heart quickening until he saw it was only old Moses. The elder, bent with 6 decades of survival, lowered himself beside Isaiah on the cabin step. His face, etched with hardship, carried a calm wisdom. "You've been mighty quiet, son," Moses said, his voice careful, cautious, the way slaves learned to speak when even walls might have ears. "Something eating at you." Isaiah weighed his reply, aware that loose words could be traded for favors or safety by informants. Just thinking, he answered, which was close enough to truth without revealing too much. Moses nodded, reading more into the silence than Isaiah said aloud. "Thinking can be dangerous for folks like us," he murmured. "But sometimes it's the only thing keeping a man's soul alive." They sat together in wordless understanding as night fell across the quarters. Around them, children played in the dirt, women patched worn clothes by firelight, and men whittled or fixed tools they'd need come dawn. These small rituals stitched together a sense of life in a world where their bodies were claimed by others. Isaiah's cabin sat at the edge of the quarters, giving him a clear view of both the big house and the road that ran toward Memphis and the unknown. That vantage point was both gift and torment. It kept him informed about the household's rhythms, but also reminded him daily of the freedom just out of reach. That night, through the small window, Isaiah noticed movement in the master's garden. Henry Caldwell had dismissed the house slaves early and now paced alone among the manicured shrubs. Margaret, claiming a headache, had retired to her room. The young master walked the same narrow path again and again, stopping at intervals to glance toward the slave quarters. Even in the moonlight, his agitation showed. This was not the calm, ordered man who prized routine and control, and the break in his pattern caught Isaiah's attention. He filed it away in the careful ledger of observations. He kept knowing that sometimes survival depended on noticing the small cracks in a master's armor. By the next morning, the routine had returned with brutal familiarity. The overseer Briggs barked orders at the gathered slaves, his leather whip always visible as he handed out assignments ready to remind anyone who faltered that their lives were not their own. Briggs had been on the Caldwell plantation longer than most of the slaves themselves, a relic of Henry's father's rule who thrived on cruelty. His whip kept order, and his brutality kept profits high, which was reason enough for Henry to keep him, despite whispers that other planters had long since abandoned such men for more modern methods of control. Isaiah's task that morning placed him near the main house, close enough to watch the rhythms of white life without appearing distracted from his work. The cotton was thick on the stalks, heavy with the weight of the harvest. Each bowl a measure of profit that determined how hard or soft the winter would be for those forced to pick it. From his vantage point, Isaiah noticed something unusual. Henry Caldwell came out of the big house far earlier than normal, dressed not in his fine planter's suit, but in plain work clothes, striding quickly toward the detached kitchen where meals for both house and quarters were prepared. Through the open doorway, Isaiah saw Clarissa at the long table, her hands moving with steady precision, born from years of knowing mistakes could mean punishment. Her presence in that room at that hour, combined with Caldwell's uncharacteristic visit, set Isaiah's stomach on edge. He bent to the cotton, but his eyes followed the master. The moment that unfolded between Henry and Clarissa needed no words for Isaiah to understand. Caldwell stood too close, his posture the entitled lean of a man who knew he could do as he pleased. Clarissa's back stiffened. Her hands faltered, her body caught between duty and fear. From a distance, it looked like conversation. But Isaiah had seen enough to know what it really was, the ritual of power, the kind that left scars deeper than any whip. When Caldwell finally left the kitchen, his face bore the smug ease of a man who had taken what he wanted. Clarissa stayed behind, still at her post, but her movements lost their natural flow. She worked like someone hollowed out her mind, retreating somewhere far from that kitchen. Isaiah's chest burned with helpless fury. He had witnessed injustice his entire life, learned to bury rage under layers of silence and endurance. But this felt different. This was a line he had long feared would one day snap. By midday, as the overseer granted the brief rest period, Isaiah found himself walking toward the kitchen without fully knowing why. The others sought shade or water, but he kept on pulled by something stronger than caution. Clarissa sat on the steps, her gaze unfixed, staring past the fields into some distance only she could see. Her tears had dried, leaving the raw trace of what had passed. When she lifted her eyes to Isaiah, the look she gave him was both broken and unbroken shame and fire living side by side. "You saw," she said at last, her voice steady enough to turn it into a fact rather than a question. Clarissa's words came out flat, not with tears or fury, but with the hollowed tone of someone forced into numbness just to keep breathing. Isaiah lowered himself onto the step beside her, knowing the risk of speaking openly, yet unwilling to let silence feel like consent. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, careful but firm. Clarissa gave a bitter laugh that scraped like broken glass. "Don't I? What choice do I have when he decides I'm what he wants? I submit, and I keep my place in the house. I resist, and I end up in the fields with hands bloodied raw if Briggs doesn't break me first." Her voice held no need for exaggeration. The truth was sharp enough. Every enslaved woman on every plantation carried the same impossible choice: resist and risk everything, or comply and slowly lose pieces of themselves. Isaiah had watched both paths destroy people in different ways. Clarissa's eyes flicked toward the fields, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's been circling me for weeks." First little comments, then brushing my hand when I served him. Today he told me plain either I'm grateful for his attention, or I'll learn what happens to those who aren't. The heat rose in Isaiah's chest, fury long familiar, but now cutting deeper. Yet along with it came something sharper, still clarity. For the first time, he didn't just feel anger. He felt the stirrings of decision. What if there was another choice, he said, surprising even himself. Clarissa turned her eyes, searching his face for answers that didn't exist in the world they both knew. Isaiah, there's no law, no court that protects us. He owns us the way he owns his horse, his furniture, even the ground we stand on. Isaiah nodded. He knew she was right legally, but law and justice had never truly been the same. Not everything that's legal is right, he said quietly, thinking of the words he had read in secret about freedom being a natural law, a God-given right. Sometimes a man has to decide which master he serves. Before she could answer, the bell rang, dragging field hands back to labor. The moment ended, but the words hung between them, unspoken promises carried into the afternoon heat. Isaiah returned to the rows of cotton, his hands moving on instinct while his mind churned. Clarissa went back to the kitchen with red-rimmed eyes, but she carried something to knowledge that someone had seen and that she was no longer completely alone. The hours passed, but Isaiah felt them differently. He picked cotton faster, almost unaware of his own movements. His mind pulling threads together, snatches of abolitionist speeches, memories of his mother's lessons, the raw injustice of Clarissa's plight, until something like a plan began to form. By nightfall, he knew the truth. The walls of patience and survival that had held him for 35 years were collapsing. He ate his dinner without tasting it, spoke to his companions without hearing his own voice lay on his palate, without closing his eyes. For the first time in his life, Isaiah wasn't simply enduring. He was preparing. The night wrapped the plantation in silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. When the quarters had gone still, and sleep had claimed most of its inhabitants, Isaiah slipped out into the moonlit dark. Every step was deliberate, his body moving with the quiet precision of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how not to be noticed. The main house loomed ahead, its white columns gleaming faintly in the silver light, a monument to wealth built on broken backs. By day, Isaiah had walked these paths countless times with tools in his hands or burdens on his shoulders, always in service. But tonight, his purpose was different. He circled to the garden at the rear of the house, a place of symmetry and careful beauty that he and others had labored to create, but were never allowed to enjoy. Sitting low in the shadows, he watched, patient but purposeful, his body still, while his thoughts pressed forward. Hours passed before the quiet broke. A flicker of lamplight appeared in an upstairs window. Then the figure of Henry Caldwell, moving through his rooms, like a man pursued by his own thoughts. Isaiah had noticed this restlessness before the pacing, the agitation that seemed to gnaw at the young master's composure. Tonight it drove him outside into the garden robe hanging loose lamp, casting shifting shadows across the manicured beds. He walked among the flowers and trimmed hedges as if searching for calm, his footsteps uneven, his movements betraying something unsettled. Isaiah didn't stir. He watched, noting every hesitation, every break in routine. When Caldwell finally lowered himself onto a bench beneath the massive oak that towered over the grounds, Isaiah felt the moment settle around him like a mantle. The tree's branches reached outward like ancient arms, its roots sunk deep into the soil that had seen generations pass through chains and toil. It had been there before the first rows of cotton, before the first bodies bent to harvest them. and now it watched this quiet collision of master and slave. Caldwell extinguished his lamp, sitting alone in the dark, a man of privilege seeking comfort in solitude. But Isaiah knew the difference between choosing silence and being forced into it. That difference propelled him forward. Bare feet moved soundlessly over the grass, every sense sharpened, every motion controlled. He had lived his life under watchful eyes. But tonight, it was Caldwell who was exposed alone beneath the ancient oak with no shield of overseer law or custom. Isaiah closed the distance until he stood just behind the bench, close enough to reach out and end the space between them. When his shadow fell across Caldwell, the master startled, turning sharply, eyes wide, as he recognized the tall figure before him. "Isaiah," he said, his tone sharp, rehearsed authority rising to cover the flicker of fear. "What are you doing here? You should be in your quarters." Isaiah didn't answer right away. He studied the face of the man who had inherited the right to command him, who believed ownership was ordained by law and scripture. The silence between them stretched, charged with the weight of 3 decades of obedience, humiliation, and survival. Until at last, Isaiah decided which master he truly served. In the moonlight, Caldwell looked softer than his age, features unscarred by hard work or real fear. And Isaiah spoke without the deferential words slaves were expected to use, saying he had come because of Clarissa, and the absence of master or sir marked the moment as different and dangerous. Caldwell moved from surprise to anger, rising to remind Isaiah of his place, and insisting that whatever Isaiah thought he knew about the master's business was none of his concern. But Isaiah stood tall and replied that Clarissa was barely 18 and had no protection against Caldwell's designs, and the master's face flushed as his hand went toward where a weapon might sit in daylight, then fell back to threats and words of authority about property and rights, and even suggested Isaiah might find himself hanging from the very tree. A casual promise born of a lifetime of unquestioned power. Yet Isaiah felt a calm like armor rather than the old paralyzing fear, and he stepped closer to tell Caldwell that tonight he was without overseer, or whips and laws did not stand between them. Here beneath the oak, and in that darkness, the usual certainties began to wobble Caldwell, checking the house for help and warning Isaiah that any attack would bring relentless pursuit and an example meant to deter others. And Isaiah acknowledged the truth of that danger while refusing to let it dictate his choice, admitting that survival counsel would urge him to step back and forget. But sensing that some moments demanded something more than mere self-preservation, and that moral truth and the weight of what had been done to Clarissa had reshaped what he was willing to risk. "No," Isaiah said, and the single syllable landed like a hammer blow. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of every humiliation, every lashing, every injustice he had endured. "I'm done pretending any of this is right. Done acting like you have some God-given authority to own people and use them however you want." Caldwell took a step back, the reality of the moment finally breaking through the arrogance that had always insulated him. He groped inside his robe for anything pistol whip, even a stick, but his fingers found only the small knife he used to cut cigars. He drew it anyway, holding it out in front of him, like a priest with a cross, more a symbol of power than an actual weapon. "You're signing your own death warrant," he said, his voice straining to regain control. "And probably the death warrants of every slave on this plantation, because they'll assume the others knew about your plans." Isaiah's eyes flicked to the knife, and a faint expression, half pity, half disgust, passed over his face. It was such a small thing, this blade. Such a perfect representation of how fragile the master's power really was, without overseer's laws and guns to back it up. "That knife isn't going to save you," he said softly, stepping closer. "And neither is the authority you think you have. Out here tonight, you're just a man who hurt a young woman because you thought no one would stop you." Caldwell lunged a desperate, clumsy motion, the knife aimed at Isaiah's chest. But Isaiah moved with the speed of someone who had spent his life reading danger. He sidestepped easily, catching Caldwell's wrist in a grip that was unshakable, forged from decades of labor. The knife clattered to the ground. Caldwell gasped, feeling himself held like a child, the strength of the man before him overwhelming. "Please," Caldwell said, the words scraping out of his throat. He had never begged before. "Whatever you're planning, think about the consequences. Think about what will happen to the others when I'm found dead." Isaiah's grip did not loosen. He heard the truth in Caldwell's words, the cruel collective punishment that would follow. But another truth, one heavier and older, pressed back. "You're right," Isaiah said, his voice low, steady, and sad. "But what you don't understand is that some things are worse than death. Watching you destroy that girl while I do nothing is one of them." Caldwell's face shifted, a flicker of something like panic sparking in his eyes. He had faced defiance before, but always within the boundaries of a system that ultimately protected him. This was different. This was a man stepping outside that system, entirely refusing its rules. "If you kill me," Caldwell tried one last time, "Clarissa still won't be safe. My wife might sell her out of spite. A new overseer might treat her worse." Isaiah's grip tightened just enough to make Caldwell wince. The master's attempts at manipulation fell flat now, like a script recited to an audience that no longer believed the play. Isaiah's face hardened into something unmovable. "You still don't understand," he said, his voice carrying the quiet finality of someone who had gone beyond fear. "This isn't about saving Clarissa, though God help her after tonight. This is about 35 years of watching people like you destroy people like us while calling it Christian duty." With his free hand, Isaiah reached into his jacket and drew out a length of rope. Thick hemp, the kind used for tying down loads and hauling bales strong enough to hold far more than one man's weight. The noose at one end had been tied carefully, each knot practiced in secret during long nights of planning. In the moonlight, the rope hung between them like a verdict that had already been passed. Caldwell's eyes went wide when he saw the rope, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the full meaning of what stood before him. This wasn't a flare of rage he could smother with threats or promises. It was something planned, something deliberate. That realization frightened him more than the rope itself. "You can't be serious," he whispered, then louder voice cracking under the strain. "This isn't just murder. This is war on everything. They'll burn the county to the ground hunting for whoever did this." Isaiah tightened his grip and guided him toward the oak, his movement steady, purposeful. The tree loomed ahead like a living witness, its branches spread wide, its trunk scarred by decades of storms and human cruelty. It had shaded auctions, watched over whippings, maybe even held the bodies of black men lynched for less than this. "I know exactly what they'll do," Isaiah said, his voice flat. "But that doesn't change what's right. And it doesn't change what I'm going to do." At the base of the tree, Caldwell tried one last time to break free, twisting and jerking toward the house. But years in the fields had made Isaiah stronger than the young master could ever imagine. He caught Caldwell easily and pressed him back against the bark, the rope now coiled like a verdict between them. "I'll give you 1 minute to pray," Isaiah said, tying the noose with deliberate care, his hands moving with the same skill that had once secured cotton bales and wagon loads. "Whatever God you think you serve, whatever you believe about salvation, now's the time." Caldwell's words tumbled out in a frantic stream, prayers laced with curses, scripture mixed with threats. He called on God to witness his innocence, demanded Isaiah remember his place, promised rewards and punishments that no longer had weight. Isaiah listened, his face unreadable, finishing the knot with the same quiet efficiency that had marked all his labor. "Time's up," he said softly. With a single motion, he threw the rope's free end over the branch and pulled. Caldwell's feet left the ground slowly, his body jerking and twisting as the reality of death erased the last traces of his authority. The knife lay forgotten in the grass. The sounds were terrible strangled breaths, involuntary kicks, the ragged noise of a body fighting to live. But Isaiah did not flinch. He stood steady, holding the rope, his expression neither triumphant nor ashamed. It was the face of a man who had finally done what needed to be done. The grim calm of justice carried out with his own hands. When Caldwell's body finally went still, Isaiah tied the rope off at the oak's base and stepped back. The corpse swayed in the night breeze, its shadow twisting across the ground in grotesque shapes. A haunting reflection of a social order turned upside down. The scene was grim, but it also felt inevitable, an image of justice shaped by centuries of oppression and answered in one brutal act. For several minutes, he stood there listening to the rope creak against the bark, listening to the night creatures carry on as though nothing had happened. The rage that had fueled him began to dissolve, leaving behind a sharper clarity. He thought of his mother Rebecca, her whispered lessons, her Bible scraps, her endless talk of patience. Was it wisdom she had given him, or just another set of chains disguised as faith? He couldn't know. Then he saw it, a pale flash in one of the upstairs windows. Margaret Caldwell's face peering through a gap in the curtain. She vanished almost as soon as she appeared, but Isaiah knew she had seen enough. His time was shorter than he had planned. Discovery wasn't a possibility anymore, it was certain. Back in the quarters, he moved with quiet efficiency. No one stirred as he collected the small bundle he had prepared, an extra shirt, a few coins from small trades, and the abolitionist book that had lit the fire inside him. Before leaving, he pulled a blackened piece of charcoal from the cold hearth and scrawled a message onto the cabin wall. Where it would be found, Clarissa, be strong. They cannot own your soul unless you let them. Remember that someone fought for you. He signed it simply with his initial. By the time he stepped out for the last time, the first pale streaks of dawn brushed the Mississippi sky. The fields he had known his whole life stretched before him, familiar and alien at once. The road to Memphis was the fastest escape, but also the most dangerous, patrolled by armed men who would have his name and description before the day was done. So he turned toward the swamps, where snakes, mud, and hidden dangers offered better odds than the certainty of patrols. The wetlands embraced him with their thick silence, their dangers impartial, their shadows deep enough to conceal a fugitive. Behind him, he knew the discovery of Caldwell's hanging body would ignite a fury that would ripple far beyond the plantation. Slave patrols, marshals, and volunteer posses would spread like wildfire. His act wouldn't just be called murder, it would be called rebellion, an assault on the entire order of the South. But the swamp didn't care about the laws of men. It cared only about survival. And with every step deeper into its dark, uncertain heart, Isaiah felt the truth. He had already crossed the line between submission and freedom, and there was no turning back. Isaiah pushed through water that rose to his waist, his legs aching as he felt along the swamp's muddy bottom for footing solid enough to hold his weight. Overhead strands of Spanish moss dangled from the cypress branches, turning the dim light into a shifting green glow that made the swamp feel like a place outside of time, half beautiful, half foreboding. Each step forward was measured deliberate and slow. He had only a rough idea of where Memphis lay north along the great river. But the maze of waterways twisted his sense of direction, and clouds often blocked the sun that was his only guide. By midday, the peace of the swamp broke. Shouts echoed faintly through the trees, and the baying of dogs carried over the water. The hunt had begun. He had expected it, but hearing it now drove home the truth. Caldwell's body had been found, and the white world would stop at nothing to make an example of the man who killed him. Isaiah pressed deeper into the wetlands, trading stealth for speed water dragging at his limbs as he forced himself forward. The terrain grew harsher. Pools deepened into open stretches of water where he had no choice but to swim, his bundle balanced above him to keep it dry. His clothes grew heavy and cold against his skin, his boots slipping apart from constant immersion, but he kept moving. By late afternoon, hunger gnawed at him, and every step required effort, yet stopping felt impossible. When he finally found a small rise of dry land, he collapsed onto it. His body trembling with exhaustion, for a few hours he rested listening. The dogs were quieter now, their sounds muffled by distance. But he knew they would return with fresh strength in the morning. Night came with new dangers. Alligators bellowed in the dark, their low roars vibrating through the water. Something large splashed close by, too close. But Isaiah had no choice but to keep moving. In the darkness, he groped his way forward, feeling each step with bare feet, trusting instinct more than vision, driven by the belief that every step northward, no matter how small, brought him closer to freedom. At dawn, the swamp seemed to relent. The water shallowed, and he found firmer ground beneath him, though each step sent a pulse of pain through his blistered feet. He paused long enough to glance back, only to see smoke rising in several places across the horizon. His pursuers were burning sections of the swamp to drive him out, signaling to one another, tightening the noose around him. This was no small search party. This was an organized hunt, the kind reserved for only the most dangerous fugitives, federal marshals, bounty hunters, and local men eager for the reward. Isaiah pulled his bundle closer, adjusting the straps with hands rubbed raw. The abolitionist book was still with him, though it weighed almost nothing compared to the hunger in his stomach and the ache in his bones. The idea of escape that had once felt like deliverance now revealed itself in harsh reality. Survival in the swamp was not noble or romantic, but brutal. And every mile was paid for with pain. Still, he pressed on, because the alternative was capture, and the certainty of a death far worse than the one he had dealt beneath the oak tree. The third day carried Isaiah out of the swamp and onto firmer ground where the landscape opened into farmland and scattered settlements. The sight of cleared fields and smoke from distant chimneys reminded him that faster travel came with greater risk. Any passerby could identify him as a runaway, and in Mississippi, a black man traveling without papers was as good as wearing chains around his neck. He stayed off the roads, hugging the tree line, choosing the cover of woods over the exposed speed of open paths, his direction fixed steadily north toward the Tennessee line. By the fourth day, hunger clawed at him hard enough to drown out caution. His body ached from days of waiting and restless nights, his boots disintegrating beneath him. When he spotted a small farmstead and an elderly black man bent over a vegetable patch, necessity overcame hesitation. He stepped out of the trees, every nerve braced for betrayal. The farmer straightened, squinting at him with a knowing weariness, born from years of reading danger in men's eyes. "You running the man," said flatly. It wasn't a question. Isaiah's ragged clothes, hollowed eyes, and desperate gait told the story plain enough. "They've been hunting somebody. Dogs and white men with guns been asking around." Isaiah nodded. There was no use in lying. "I killed my master," he said, his voice steady but stripped bare. "He was fixing to hurt a young woman, and I couldn't stand by." The farmer studied him for a long, quiet stretch, his gaze heavy, as if weighing not just Isaiah's words, but the burden of truth itself. At last he said, "That's a hanging offense. If they catch you, they'll make it slow. Make sure folks remember." "I know," Isaiah answered, "but it doesn't change what I did. Some things are worth dying for, even if you can't win." The old man's eyes flicked toward the cabin where smoke curled from the chimney and children's laughter carried faintly through the window. His voice dropped low. I got grandchildren in there. If they learn I helped you, those babies might pay for it." Isaiah nodded, already turning away. "I won't ask you to risk your family. Just point me in the direction where a man might last a little longer." The farmer glanced over his shoulder, checking the fields and tree line before raising his hand toward a ridge in the distance. "There's an old hunting cabin 10 miles that way. Empty for years, far as I know. Might buy you a night's rest if you can reach it unseen." Isaiah murmured his thanks and started off, but the man called him back. With a slow bend, he pulled several sweet potatoes from the soil, wrapping them in a cloth. "Take these. Ain't much, but it's something to keep you moving." Isaiah accepted the gift with quiet gratitude, understanding the weight of the risk the man had taken for him. It was more than food. It was a reminder that even under the crushing weight of slavery, solidarity still existed, even when it had to be whispered. By dusk, Isaiah reached the ridge and found the hunting cabin. The structure leaned tiredly against time boards, warped roof sagging, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. It had the look of abandonment, a place forgotten by white hunters who once used it as shelter. But for Isaiah, it was a sanctuary. Inside it smelled of old wood and dust, but it was dry, hidden, and still standing. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without fear of immediate pursuit, though he knew it would not last long. The group studied him hard, eyes weighing every line of his face and the truth in his words, and after a long silence, the tall white man who led them spoke pragmatically about risk and reward, naming the $1,000 bounty that turned every mercenary and slave catcher into a threat, which made Isaiah feel the cold fact of how many lives he might have dragged into danger. But the settlement decided to act with careful courage, moving him not to the open store or the church where anyone might stumble on him, but to a cellar beneath an old granary that smelled of dust and dry corn, where a few trusted families took turns standing watch and sharing the thin rations they could spare, while elders argued low-voiced about routes, false papers, and a riverman who might ferry him north under cover of night. And a woman named Ruth, whose own son had once escaped and never returned, pressed a coarse jacket into Isaiah's hands and tied his hair back with a scrap so he would look less like the tall field hand the posters described. And though he wanted to protest that he could not ask so much of them, he watched as faces he had expected to recoil instead hardened with solidarity, and an old farmer who had already risked him some sweet potatoes now offered the only clear thing Isaiah had been searching for, a plan that might move him out of the county before fresh hunters lined the roads. And as dusk fell, they murmured cautions about Clarissa, promising to send word through trusted messengers if she remained alive and safe, which gave Isaiah a thin, aching hope, even as the weight of what he had done and what more might come pressed down. Because aid here came with a price and a timetable and no guarantee. But it was the first time since he left the oak that someone other than himself was working toward a future that did not end in a rope or a courtroom, and for now, that had to be enough. The leader's words fell like a warning bell in Isaiah's ears. Help would come, but it came tied to responsibility. "You're part of something bigger than your own escape," he had said, and Isaiah understood. If he failed, if he was captured, he would not just lose his life. He could unravel entire routes that had taken years to build, endangering countless others who still dreamed of freedom. Led deeper into the settlement, Isaiah saw for the first time how real and organized resistance could look. Families worked together in quiet, practiced rhythm. Children carried messages disguised as chores. Lanterns hung in coded patterns to signal safety. Armed sentries moved like shadows on the edge of fields, watching not only for bounty hunters, but for spies, men who posed as runaways to betray these fragile networks. The place wasn't large, but it carried the weight of purpose, a defiance that existed only because every person here had chosen to live in danger rather than silence. Isaiah's next steps would be more perilous than anything he had yet faced. The routes north ran through slave states, bristling with patrols, bounty hunters, and informants eager for reward. $1,000 was more than most men would see in a lifetime, and it made him a prize as much as a fugitive. Yet for the first time since the oak tree, Isaiah felt hope stirring in him again. Not because the danger had lessened, but because he was no longer walking alone. News traveled fast, and within a week, it reached even this hidden outpost. Margaret Caldwell had abandoned the plantation, selling off land and people before retreating to Memphis. Clarissa had been sent south to New Orleans, her future swallowed by that city's slave markets. Her fate was unknown, but her suffering continued in new hands. Back in Mississippi, the Caldwell plantation stood gutted. Its master gone, its mistress fled. But the ancient oak remained. It became a symbol whispered in quarters across the Delta, a story of the man who turned the tools of slavery against its master, who refused to accept that injustice was God's plan. Beneath its wide branches, Isaiah Turner's name began to live in legend, a spark of defiance carried from mouth to mouth like contraband scripture. Isaiah himself vanished into the shadows of the Underground Railroad, folded into its hidden roots and secret hands. Whether his path would lead him to free soil or to a hunter's noose remained uncertain. But one truth had already been carved into history: he was no longer property. Whatever came next, he moved as a free man, carrying with him the memory of the oak, the weight of Clarissa's suffering, and the knowledge that his act had shaken the foundations of a system built on silence. Isaiah Turner's trail faded into secrecy as conductors of the Underground Railroad took over his journey, moving him from safe house to safe house toward the Canadian border. Whether he survived the perilous trek to free soil or perished along the way remained unknown, even to those who risked everything to help him. But his story did not vanish. In the slave quarters of Mississippi, and later across the South, his name was spoken in whispers like a forbidden hymn. The tale of the man who had left his master hanging from the oak tree became both a warning and a promise. A warning to those who clung to power, that even the most submissive field hand might one day refuse to bow, and a promise to the enslaved that resistance was possible, that one act of courage could ripple through generations. By the time Union soldiers marched through Mississippi years later, the oak still stood, and the newly freed told the story with pride. They spoke of how freedom's seeds had been planted not just by generals and politicians, but by men like Isaiah Turner, who refused to accept the world as it was. Beneath that tree, soldiers heard about the night a slave chose justice over fear, dignity over obedience, and defiance over survival. The house crumbled, the fields went to wild growth, but the oak remained, its branches spreading over soil watered by struggle. Locals said, if you stood beneath it at night, you could still feel the weight of the rope, hear the echo of defiance in the creak of the boughs. History books would pass over Isaiah's name, preferring battles and proclamations. But among those who had lived under the whip, his memory endured. Whether he died in the swamps or walked free in Canada, his act had already made him immortal. His was the legacy of every slave who chose resistance over silence, every whispered prayer that freedom was worth any price, every quiet act of rebellion that chipped away at the foundations of bondage. Isaiah Turner's story ended where it began, beneath an oak tree with a rope. But what it left behind was proof that even in slavery's darkest hour, the human spirit could choose fire over ashes, freedom over fear, and the brief brilliance of defiance over the long shadow of submission.